All right. Hi, everybody. It's Dr. B, and we are going to do a new episode in the Uncomfortable Conversations series. This one is called Teens and Suicide. Just FYI, in the background, we have Melissa Morrison. She's running all the behind the scenes show. So thanks to Melissa. Thank you, Melissa. And I'm Dr. B, clinical psychologist and early childhood educator. And today, like I said, we're going to be talking about uncomfortable conversations, teens, and suicide. All right, Melissa, let's go to the next slide. Yes, people ask all the time, should I talk about death and suicide with children or teenagers? The answer is unequivocally yes. Have conversations with teens and adolescents and even children sometimes about death and suicide. So important to have uncomfortable conversations. None of us want to do it. That's why they're called uncomfortable. However, they do allow us to disperse energy and people feel better after that. So next slide. Suicide, you may or may not know, is the second leading cause of death among 10-year-olds to 24-year-olds. That is an amazing statistic. It's terrifying. And with COVID-19 and our world sort of in this tumultuous zone, teens and young children even as well are struggling with depression and suicide, unfortunately, at very high rates. So we have to have conversations if we're going to prevent suicide. Next slide. All right. You may or may not have heard the term adverse childhood experiences, but adverse childhood experiences quantify trauma in ways that we haven't really used before. And now we can clearly say that trauma before the age of 18 has an impact on people's health and mental health, physical health and mental health. And the 10 things that are considered adverse childhood experiences, although we know there are many, many more, are physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, or household dysfunction, which means a parent with or somebody in the household with mental illness, an incarcerated person from the household, substance misuse, witnessing a mother treated violently, or death or divorce or separation from a loving caregiver in the household. Now, there are more trainings on adverse childhood experiences and trauma where we really dig deep into what all of this means, but it's important to know that before the age of 18, any or all of these things, if they've happened to you, are considered one adverse childhood experience. So that it's a scale of 1 to 10. And that number can be mediated by lots of positive experiences that we also have and relationships. However, they also contribute to things like depression, potential suicide risk, misuse of drugs or alcohol, protective weight gain, and a myriad of other physical and mental health challenges. So with that, if you're interested, go check it out. Find some more videos that we do or classes on adverse childhood experiences and trauma and resilience. Next slide. So connection. It's so important to how young people grow up and view the world in their lives. So talking about suicide does not make it more likely to happen. In fact, actually, it's the opposite. It's less likely to happen if we can have open conversations about what this means and how to provide interventions. Next slide. connecting the dots actually disrupt the negative energy that a teen might be feeling or a young person might be feeling. This is actually true regardless of whether you're a child, a teenager, or an adult. But when we put the dots together, then we're able to actually understand more, and that disrupts the intense weight that comes with depression, anxiety, and all the things that are contributors potentially to having feelings of wanting to complete suicide or attempt suicide. Next slide. Expression disrupts implosion. So what does implosion mean? It means that we're just blowing up from the inside out. And so when people are allowed to express their feelings, we disrupt this implosive feeling of destruction and turn it into something positive, which is expression. And expression can happen in so many different forms. Think about it: art, music, exercise, sports teams, sporting events, playing on a team. There are dance, singing. I mean, the list goes on and on. If you know what your expressive avenue is that makes you feel better, and when you're able to participate that in a way openly, it does disrupt the implosion inside of feelings that people have. So we really want to, this is an intervention when we provide opportunities for expression. All right, next slide, please. So boundaries are so important. And oftentimes we don't give enough credence to the idea of what boundaries mean and where they are relevant. Well, boundaries are relevant across the lifespan. I think people usually think of boundaries as toddlers need boundaries or adults set, adult boundaries. But every age and stage needs a good set of boundaries. And so the boundary line is moving all the time, which makes parenting challenging because as soon as you get comfortable with a boundary, your child probably has grown and matured and maybe needs that boundary line moved out a little bit further, or vice versa, and they need that boundary moved in. Or in the COVID-19 world, everything has changed and we need to set into place new boundaries. And so, like wearing masks, like social distancing, like, how do you have conversations about COVID-19 or difficult things? So we will do an uncomfortable conversation about COVID-19. But in this episode, we're talking about depression and suicide in adolescents. So when we set boundaries with teens, we have to set loving limits that supports youth in navigating the ever-changing complexities of the world. So adolescents, their brains are really in redevelopment, or they're continuing to develop, but a lot's coming online when you're an adolescent. Hormones are kicking in a lot, you're growing into a new body. There's just sexuality is beginning to emerge, independent thinking, abstract thinking. All of these things are sort of coming into the fold of being a young adult, a teenager. So it's very important that as parents and teachers and mentors and caregivers of this age group, that we set loving boundaries and limits that support that emerging new self that's appearing as teens come online as adolescents. So next slide, please. All right, relationships. I talk about this in everything I do, but relationships are so important to resilience or to the ability to overcome adversity and get through to the next stage of whatever it is that's going on. Now, one attuned friend or family member can literally change the trajectory of a youth's life. That means that being a friend or an attuned family member to a youth is invaluable. I mean, it just is absolutely critical to be aware of how important your connection and relationship is to young people or to a young person. And the other thing that you have to be aware of is that teenagers, because of their brain development and because of the way they're changing and growing, they're much more impulsive in this period of life than they are later on in life. And so this one relationship can be a real stabilizer and support children and young or adolescents who might be thinking about suicide or attempt of suicide, or what would the world be like if I weren't here. That can be a really impulsive thought that can be acted upon, and then it's over. We don't get a second chance. So recognizing the impulsivity of this age group is very important when you are a mentor or loving support person in a relationship with an adolescent, parent or teacher or coach. So we are more important than we give ourselves credit for. Next slide, please. Bullying. There is no way around the concept and the practice that bullying contributes to depression, number one, and suicide. I mean, we have direct links of bullying behavior that have led to adolescents and young adults and even children as young as 10, 9, who have completed suicide based on bullying behavior of other people. So bullying is a major risk factor in depression and suicide. And yes, we give a lot of conversation to bullying, about it in schools and about it in the neighborhood and even in families, because bullying can literally happen in your own home. And so we have to address bullying head on. Again, another uncomfortable conversation. But bullying is one of those boundaries that is not allowed to be crossed. If you're a bully, you need to be stopped by an adult. An adult needs to stop that behavior. Otherwise, we are all responsible for the possibility of the child or young adolescent being bullied to complete suicide or attempt suicide. We can't pretend that that is not real. That is absolutely the truth about how serious bullying is. It is a contributor to depression and suicide, period. We need to take it that seriously. It's like holding a gun and saying, oh, it's not that big a deal. Kids will be kids. No, that's not what bullying is. Bullying is like holding a loaded weapon. All right, and you can see, look, with social media added to the equation, bullying becomes exponentially harmful with social media instantly. Videos. You can tell 1,000 people or 10,000 people something really embarrassing or awful in the click of a button. So this kind of behavior, we have to address it from the emotional inside out level. We know the bully is being harmed also. There's no question about it. We know the bully is being harmed, so we have to address the source, but we also have to provide loving care and intervention and support for the child who is being bullied. All right, next slide, please. So Teenagers, adolescents, and neurobiology. What does that mean? The brain is changing. The brain is in still redesign and design mode. And it's reorganizing now and preparing for the adolescent, more early adulthood experience of life, adding on those hormones that change the body, sexuality, and contribute to a more abstract way of thinking, even though the brain is not fully developed until what we know now is about 24, 25 years old. So people say all the time to me, oh my gosh, kids, they're so young, even in their early 20s. And, when we were kids, we were living on our own, and it seemed like so much more mature in our late teens. Well, the reality is that, guess what? We weren't so much more mature or prepared for the world at 17, 18, 19. But what happened was the world was expecting us to be adults in it that we weren't necessarily ready for. And so now, with this new neurobiology understanding and information, we can actually adjust the world more to fit the developmental experience we understand about adolescents and teens growing up, which is so important. If the brain doesn't stop wiring and growing and reorganizing, which it never does in life, it never is like a hard stop, but it definitely slows down. The speed racer period of life is birth to 3, prenatal really to 3, where most of the brain, 80% of your brain is developed by the age of 3. Doesn't mean that all the information you need or will have in your lifetime is there at age 3, but the infrastructure is there. So we have to really, really focus on how important that period of life is. Now, adolescents are starting to work with and use that operating system and have experiences. Literally, adolescence is the most creative period of life for any human being. So we should be maximizing that opportunity and supporting creative experiences with adolescents, because their brain is never going to be better prepared for it than during adolescence. And they're come up with the most innovative and exciting and artistic and creative ways of solving problems and doing things. So with that information, let's use that to our advantage. And they're going to do it anyway, which is why kids always figure out the backdoor way of getting around something. And unfortunately, sometimes that can go south very quickly. And that way of getting around something is by checking out. And checking out can mean attempting or completing suicide, which we don't want. That's why we have conversations. Next slide, please. All right, the brain, we're still talking about the brain. It's in service of survival. If you touch your brain, if you feel your forehead and you touch the back of your head, your brain is inside there. And the main job of your brain is to keep you alive. So keeping you alive is so important that it's the major job of the brain. And this little boy diving into the water, his body and brain are talking to him literally, like there's an internal voice going on saying, okay, don't breathe in the water, otherwise it'll, you'll choke and you might drown. And so we have to remember that there's always this unconscious system running to keep us alive, whether it's our heart beating. We're not thinking about every heartbeat. We're not thinking about every breath that goes in our mouth and we exhale. We're not thinking about our blood pressure all the time. Part of our brain is already managing that for us. But the brain is in service of survival, and it helps us make decisions about what's a good idea to do, safety or survival risk, and what is maybe not such a great idea. Now, adolescence is this weird period of time where the brain is wiring up for a new stage of life, for adulthood. And so there can be weak points. In adolescence, actually, the number one leading cause of death is accidents, because kids aren't great predictors of risk during this age range. And so they can overestimate their capability or overestimate the safety of something and be in trouble very quickly and die from it, unfortunately, in an accident. So this is a vulnerable period of life. It's also important to remember that the brain wires where the brain fires. So what does that mean? That's kind of a weird saying. It means that whatever the brain is doing, whatever a person is doing, activates the brain, and the brain is firing and hooking up information for that person to use for the rest of their lives. So if we take the opportunity to help the brain fire where we want it to wire, in relationships, in good decision making, in logical thinking, in evaluating decisions and problem solving, and that's how we want the brain to fire, then we need to support that in its wiring. So we have an opportunity. I know this is heavy stuff, but we have an opportunity to really make giant strides in how we raise kids when we're talking about adolescence, suicide, safety, friendships, relationships, all of these things. This is a vulnerable period similar to early adolescence. I didn't mean to say adolescence. I meant to say similar to early childhood. Kids look bigger, but actually adolescence is literally a repeat of development of toddlerhood. They're just in bigger bodies. They have a lot more language. There's a lot more freedom and flexibility because they look old. They seem more mature. But in reality, their brain is almost repeating the exact same stage as it experienced in toddlerhood. Now that is a piece of information. What would you let a toddler do if you were to then overlay just age as you're a teenager? What does that look like in terms of parenting? Big questions. We want to actually probably set really healthy, safe boundaries and have lots and lots of conversations to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And I understand how you're feeling and you understand how I'm feeling. And we can talk about risks and good choices and ideas. All right, next slide, please. All right, love. I love this slide. But what does that even mean? How do you know that your love is the same as my love? Love is a very abstract feeling, and it's very difficult to quantify in terms of, what does that mean? But we do know when we love something, we feel it. It's we feel it in our body. And that's so important that people from infancy all the way through the end of life get the opportunity to have that abstract feeling of love directed at them as much as possible. That's what relationships are. And loving relationships happen between children and parents, children and caregivers, siblings, other relatives in their family. Love happens between friends. Love happens between partners. Love happens between lions. And love happens between, anything that we can have a relationship with. So we even say things like, I love watermelon. I do love watermelon. So that is, it's a feeling. It's also a preference and a taste that I have. So love is abstract. How do you say I love my children and I love watermelon in the same sentence? Well, there's varying degrees of love, but we all know what love is when we feel it. It's important to remember that love is such a powerful emotion across the lifespan. And in adolescence, that can even feel more intense because for the first time, really, we're putting this label on this feeling and emotion that's coming online in a different way. It's getting sort of I don't want to say rebuilt because it's always been there. I mean, babies experience love from the get-go. It just looks different, and we as adults experience it differently. Adolescents, love comes online. They maybe have their first, girlfriend, boyfriend, something relationship. They may be recognizing these emotional feelings, and that can be very intense. So again, it can sometimes be a really uncomfortable conversation to talk to a teen about love, but we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable because sometimes the thing that feels so good when it's taken away from us or interfered with in some way can push someone who's not feeling super stable into an unsafe zone in terms of suicide ideation, which means thinking about suicide and potentially planning in their head how that could potentially play out. And we do not want kids to be in that zone. We do not want adolescents to be in that zone. Okay, next slide, please. Depression is real. Depression, we know this, and it's gotten so much worse in terms of COVID-19 and being isolated and quarantined, out of school, away from our social networks, needing to socially distance. All of these things have really amped up depression. What is depression? In a lot of times people refer to depression as anger turned inward. I'm mad because I have to wear a mask. I can't see my friends. I don't get to go to the places that I normally got to go to. I don't get to play the sports that I was able to play and have these outlets for, remember, dispersing expression of energy, which helps alleviate depression. Now we're really stuck with not having a whole lot of outlets for that anger that's turned inward. And depression actually changes the brain. This is your prefrontal cortex. This is where your abstract reasoning occurs. And so what you can see is on the healthy brain, there's some red and orange coloring that's going on there. And that shows the blood flow in that part of the brain. And so when a brain is healthy and there's blood flow in the front of the brain, we know that depression is at bay. It's not there. That's not depression. When somebody suffers from chronic depression that's untreated, that blood flow isn't happening in the frontal part of the brain, the frontal cortex, the frontal part of the brain. And when we look at this, which we don't get to walk around and just look at people's fMRI screens of their brain, this is what we would see. And this is how, in some ways, eventually I predict that we will be diagnosing depression much more medically, excuse me, than we do the way we do now. And it's not that I don't think that depression is identifiable without an fMRI, but I think that it's important that we use all the tools that we have at our disposal in order to support people's physical and mental health. So recognizing that our environment internally, what we say to ourselves, as well as externally, what people say to us and our experiences, have a very powerful impact on how our brain grows and develops, adapts, and is built for us to survive in the environment in which we're going to live in. What does that mean? It means that if you have to survive and live in an abusive, scary, survivalistic environment, you are going to build a brain that expects survival instincts to be right at the surface. If you grow up in a loving, safe, protected, caregiving environment where people shelter you and shield you from trauma and help scaffold your growth and development, your survival instincts and actions and reactions can come up as needed, but they don't have to occupy the prime real estate in the front of your brain all the time. So kids that have high adverse childhood experiences. So remember, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect. Maybe they have a family member who's incarcerated, somebody who misuses substances, pills, alcohol, other drugs. If they lose a parent to death or separation or abandonment, divorce, if you witness your parent or loving caregiver treated violently, if you have a parent or a caregiver who you love who has a mental illness, who struggles with mental illness, then these are all things that bring the survival need to the surface to take up that real estate. And it doesn't allow for our brain to be occupied with things like our creativity, our relationships, our problem-solving skills, all of those things that we really do need to have an enjoyable, and I like to say what parents always say about their kids, a happy life. We can want all kinds of things for our kids, but at the end of the day, we really want them to be happy. And the only way for kids to be able to be happy is for that prime real estate to be padded with a healthy blood flow. So I hope that makes sense. All right, next slide. Vulnerable and the unknowns. Early life experiences, we're just talking about this, set the stage for managing unexpected and adverse experiences. So what does that mean? That means that that children, as they're growing up, are faced with unexpected and adverse experiences, problematic experiences, difficult experiences. That's fine, because usually, ideally, in the best of the world, we have parents and teachers and mentors and adults who scaffold and support those adverse experiences and help children manage their way through them with language and experiences. Now, when early life experiences are left to children to manage on their own, that creates a strong vulnerability for children. And that vulnerability leads to health and mental health risks and risk factors. And one of those risk factors is depression and suicide. There is a correlation between adverse experiences, adverse childhood experiences, and higher levels of depression and higher levels of attempt and completed suicide. So it's very important that we know how to support children in managing these difficult experiences that happen. Now, I say that cautiously because even though you may have a myriad of adverse experiences in life, it only takes a few positive experiences and relationships to really change and transform the trajectory or the path that a child ends up going down. So we can actually influence the negative road strongly by providing positive interventions and preventions in place to support kids. So it actually takes the saying, less is more is actually really true in this arena. We can handle less positive and more negative and get to a better outcome than when we have negative only without any positive. So, all right, next slide, please. When nothing matters anymore, we're on a very, very slippery slope. And we often can get this confused with teens and adolescents because they seem like nothing matters a lot of the time, or they can have very strong mood swings that take them into a place that seems like a total dead end. Or maybe they actually run into a dead end. And something that actually I think leads to that sense of being at a dead end is criticism without any options. When somebody just doesn't see your value and are critical, but they can never ever take in the shift or the good things about someone, that feels so dead-endish and like there's nowhere to go. And adolescents are highly sensitive to that. So, and I'm making a really broad statement. I get that because there's millions and millions of adolescents, and some are much more sensitive than others. And it's, everybody's an individual. But in general, because of how the brain is developing, there is a high sensitivity to criticism and a quick road to dead end. So when an adolescent actually feels trapped, they're unable, because of their brain development, to see the possibilities, which can quickly and impulsively lead to self-harm or suicide if there are no other options. So this is a conversation. Uncomfortable, yes, but very doable to say to a teen that you have a relationship with is, I understand that sometimes you can feel trapped. And I know as an adult that sometimes when people feel trapped, they go to a place in their mind that the world would be better if I wasn't here anymore. And they think about things like suicide or self-harm. And I want you to know that we can talk about that. Have you ever felt that way? Or do you know anybody who's felt that way? And when you open that door, now you're inviting in a conversation that's very hard for an adolescent to start, but oftentimes they're dying to have. And they're dying to talk about it with an adult. And they've probably had an experience where an adolescent friend of theirs, or they know of somebody who has attempted or completed suicide, and they've talked to each other about. So let's insert the adult conversation into the messaging, because we don't want kids to hit the dead end, because that's a very dangerous place. They run into the dead end, and rather than recognizing they can just turn around and go a different way, adolescent brain says, oh yeah, dead end. That's it. That's the end of the road. maybe this is where I stop for forever. And we don't want that to be the case. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 has really, really exponentially heightened our experience of big feelings on a social justice level, on a health level, on a fear level, on a sadness level, an isolation, missing people. We have tears, we feel emptiness, anger, fogginess. Remember that anger is depression turned inward. So there's high levels of depression happening during this COVID-19 pandemic. And then we also have our political climate is so divisive right now that there's also a lot of anger and big feelings around that and around, do you wear masks? Don't you wear masks? Why not? Getting vaccinated, not getting vaccinated. Now, these are things that adolescents are talking about and thinking about and have really strong opinions about and are capable of making decisions about. However, this is where one of those places where a lot of times the adults come in with their soundbite advice and bombard kids with just a little bit of information and then take away their ability to really think for themselves and have an opportunity to have a conversation with an adult about the situation, about COVID-19, about vaccines, about what's going on with social distancing and missing school and missing friends, or maybe not missing school because now you're not getting bullied anymore, or your friend who got sick, or maybe their grandparent who died. We don't know, but big feelings are everywhere at this moment in time and in history. And we need to step through the door and have the conversations. If you notice that if you notice an adolescent or even a child or anybody really, this is fundamental for me. If you notice that somebody's starting to tear up and their eyes are starting to water, invite them to just let it go. Invite people to just cry. It's okay to let those tears go. And a lot of times when you say that, and if you're a safe person, the tears will then flow, which is so good, because if you think about tears and crying, it really is like a cleansing of the emotional space. It's like wiping off the whiteboard for a little bit of time and then getting a new opportunity to write new things on it. So we all need to clean the whiteboard off occasionally. And this is a time where there are so many angry conversations going around that we're not even having the important, calm, thoughtful conversations that, again, make us feel uncomfortable, but we need to be talking about in order to protect our adolescents from trying to figure it out for themselves. They can't figure it out for themselves because the adults in the room aren't even figuring it out for themselves. This is a global pandemic that we've never experienced since the Spanish flu over 100 years ago. So we are figuring it out, but we haven't figured it out. So there's so much information in a brain that's being built. So it literally is like trying to provide information while you're building an airplane in the air. That is the least effective way to build an airplane. And in fact, I don't want to fly on an airplane while it's being built in the air. But if we think about adolescents and their brains, and they're getting all this information, it's a little bit like trying to ask them to build their brain in the air as if it's an airplane. And it's not fair, which is why we bring it down to the surface and say, let's talk about it. Let's have an uncomfortable conversation. it's going to be okay. And I'm here with you. So, and I don't necessarily have all the answers, but we can certainly try to figure some things out together. And we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. We don't need to be right. We just need to be present and available and emotionally open to seeing tears and hearing about big feelings. All right, so here we are at this slide, and I'm going to be very direct about this one. Dead or alive? Yes, it's a question. The kids who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender are at astronomical risk of depression, suicide, self-harm, because they're rejected, they're criticized, they're not accepted in society as equal citizens. And that is tragic and traumatic. And so it's very, very important for parents who are concerned about suicide, self-harm, depression in their children to ask themselves this question. You may not want to be the parent of a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender child, but would you rather be the parent of a child who's dead? I get it. That's direct. But the reality is that it happens consistently. It happens regularly. Things are changing, which is so good. As you can see on the cover of Sports Illustrated, it says, opening eyes, speaking truths, and changing minds. Lena Bloom on the cover of Sports Illustrated is a trans woman model on a major sports magazine, the major sports magazine. So the world is changing, and it's so good that we're seeing people represented across society. However, there is still a lot of hostility and hate towards the LGBTQ community, and particularly young adolescents who may be questioning their sexual orientation or gender identity, puts them at incredibly high risk, especially if they don't have supportive adults in their lives to help walk them through this very confusing and complicated process of growing up, which is coming to terms with and understanding our sexuality, our gender identity, and all of the things that come with partnering later on in our lives. And so, but it's such an important part of people's lives. Most people do end up in loving relationships with other people. And so whether that ends up being a woman with a woman, or a man with a man, or a trans person with another trans person, or maybe a straight person, there are so many combinations that are absolutely perfectly normal. And we are moving in this direction, but we're talking about uncomfortable conversations related to teens and suicide. And this is a very uncomfortable part of that conversation, because kids who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender die at, I want to say, 5 times the rate of heterosexual teens. That's not okay. That says, that in and of itself screams second-class citizen status, and we are not second-class citizens. Adolescents who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender are not second-class citizens. We are all humans. And so equality and recognition of this is so important. Next slide, please. Prevention is not prediction. We cannot predict suicide. What we can do is put in place lots of preventative measures in order to prevent suicide. We don't necessarily know whether we've prevented it or not unless somebody tells us. But adolescents and people, they do studies where people actually do report that, oh, I did not complete suicide because of this happening. So we do know a lot about prevention, but that is not the same thing as prediction. I've been with 2 people in my lifetime who the night before they completed successfully, which is a terrible way of putting it, who completed suicide. One when I was an adolescent, and my friend, he went home and he ended up killing himself. Another friend who, as an adult, I was at their house with several other people and kids, and the next morning got the news that he got up that early that morning. So there is no way to predict whether somebody is going to harm themselves and commit or complete suicide. But we can do things. We know that loving, attuned relationships are important. We know that having uncomfortable conversations, we know that giving people the opportunity to express themselves and to have access to mental health care are all important preventions in terms of being able to predict our reduction in suicide. So, but we can't get those 2 concepts confused, because nobody has the ability to predict violence or suicide. When a youth shares with other trusted people about depression, this unlocks new channels of self-discovery. When people are able to have difficult conversations about uncomfortable things, that says we have a relationship. That says something is special about our friendship. And I trust you enough to share my vulnerability. And when you can share your vulnerability with somebody, you automatically become safer. You actually become safer. When we let adolescents or our children be vulnerable with us, we make the world safer for them. So I'm inviting you to be a trusted person in an adolescent's life. Be a trusted person in your children's lives. Be a trusted person in your children's friends' lives. Be a trusted person in every adolescent's life that you touch, because it can mean the difference between life and death. All right. Support and interventions. There are interventions out there. There is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, where people can talk, text, check out the website, lots of resources there. There's also the Trevor Project, which is the suicide prevention hotline for specifically lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender youth, adolescents. So there's PFLAG, there's a lot of resources in the world, but we have to get people to be able to access them. That's the only way we actually can stop the train. So please, if you know somebody who is at risk of suicide or self-harm, reach out and provide support. Provide a supportive hand, have an uncomfortable conversation, and do the interventions that need to be done in order to prevent a suicide from happening. As we wrap up, I want you to remember a few things. One, talking about suicide does not cause suicidal ideation, which means thoughts of suicide or ways of completing suicide. Two, we cannot predict suicide, but we can put in place preventions that reduce the likelihood of somebody completing suicide. Dead or alive, ask yourself this very hard question. Would I rather somebody be dead than gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender? If that's a deal breaker for you, then get out of the way, because we need to bring in more people who are loving, kind, and accepting, not tolerant. I'm over tolerant. I don't want to hear that word anymore. We need loving, accepting, and kind and compassionate people who embrace equality around gender identity and sexual orientation. That's what's going to prevent suicide. Number 4, recognizing that bullying is a major factor in depression of all youth, including the LGBT population, but bullying is a thing and it needs to be addressed by adults consistently so it stops. Like, there can't be this like, oh, we did something and it didn't work. Oh, sorry. That's not good enough. Bullying has gotten way out of control and people die because of bullying. So we need to get our act together in terms of understanding bullying in the home, bullying at school, and bullying in the community. None of it's okay. And we can set boundaries in place to reduce it. And the first step is recognizing that the bully has trauma that's been undealt with. All right, with that, we are through with uncomfortable conversations about teens and suicide. I hope this was helpful and informative to you. If you'd like to learn more about our uncomfortable conversation series, please check out the website at www.drbconnections.com. And with that, go out and leave a life print. Thanks so much. I really appreciate your support and listenership.